The hum of the engine echoed through the silent desert. Huge dunes stretched to the horizon like frozen sea waves. Max and Alex raced across the sand in their trusty Jeep, enjoying the deserted expanses. The hot sun beat down mercilessly, causing the air to tremble, as if a haze enveloped every meter of the earth. "Look at that!" Max exclaimed, sticking his hand out the window. "Pure freedom, no noise of cities, just us and this endless desert." Alex, who was driving, just grinned. "The main thing is not to get stuck here forever, otherwise freedom will quickly become a curse." The friends had been driving deep into the desert for several hours, leaving behind the last traces of civilization. They took enough water, food, and fuel with them, so they didn't worry. This trip was supposed to be a test of the spirit, a couple of nights under the stars, silence, and hot days that could test anyone's strength. But then everything didn't go according to plan. Suddenly, the engine sneezed loudly and died. The Jeep jerked and froze, like a tired animal that refused to go any further. Alex turned the key in the ignition, but the engine only wheezed in response. Max got out of the car and opened the hood. A light smoke billowed out. "Oh, no," I said. "This is already bad." "Is it very bad?" Alex wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at his friend hopefully. Max was silent. He rummaged under the hood, trying to find the problem, but without tools and in the scorching heat, it was useless. The engine overheated. "Maybe there's something wrong with the fuel pump, or the wiring. Anyway, I don't know. Can we fix it?" Max sighed heavily, slamming the hood. "Without tools and spare parts?" "No." There was an uneasy silence. They exchanged glances. Now the situation was no longer just an adventure. "Okay, don't panic. We have water, food, and the nights in the desert are cold, we won't cook." But Alex was already pulling out his phone, hoping to call or at least send a message. He stared at the screen, then shook his head. "There is no connection." Max also took out his phone. "There are no signals." "And how far are we from the nearest city?" Alex looked at the GPS navigator, but it froze, the battery was dead. He cursed under his breath. They were a few hours away from the last settlement, but walking through the desert is a completely different story. Max sat down in the shadow of the car and exhaled heavily. We got there. The heat was thickening, water was limited, and there was nowhere to look for help. They were trapped in the desert, the sun beat down mercilessly, turning the air into a trembling wall of heat. Alex and Max sat in the shadow of the car, trying not to waste their energy. Sweat was running down his face, his clothes were sticking to his body, and his breathing was getting heavy. "We can't just sit here. Something has to be done." Max wiped his forehead, his voice as dry as sand itself. Alex nodded silently. They had water, but it would last a maximum of a day or two if they didn't waste it thoughtlessly. They divided the supplies, 1 bottle for each. "No big sips, just a little bit at a time, otherwise the body will not digest," Alex warned, taking a tiny sip. Max looked at the bottle with displeasure, but obeyed. "Search for shelter. We need a shadow. The car heats up like a stove." They took a blanket out of the trunk, stretched it over the side of the car, creating a kind of canopy. It helped, but not much, the heat was getting everywhere anyway. "The best option is to move at night," Alex said. "For now, we're staying here, saving our strength." Max nodded, but he looked uneasy. He wasn't used to sitting around, especially in a situation like this. "Do you think where to go?" Alex looked at the horizon. "Yesterday there were rocks in the distance. Maybe there are caves or water there. If we're lucky, we'll find an oasis." "If we're lucky," Max muttered. They had no other options. The first steps into the unknown. As soon as the sun disappeared below the horizon, the heat began to subside. The wind was cooler, but the desert was in no hurry to become more hospitable. "We'll take everything we need. Water, food, a lantern. I could use a gun. From whom? From scorpions? Alex chuckled. From everything. They left the car behind and headed towards the cliffs. They were surrounded by dead silence, no birds, no insects, just the rustle of sand under their feet. The further they walked, the more the void pressed down. Do you feel it? Max said softly. What? It's like something's watching us. Alex just shook his head. They were in the middle of a desolate wilderness. There couldn't have been anyone here, or could there? They continued on their way, but now every step was echoing in their heads. The night in the desert was unexpectedly cold. The heat that had been tormenting them all day was replaced by a sharp, biting wind. Every step on the loose sand was difficult, my feet sank in, and it seemed like they were stomping on the spot. How far is it? Max asked, adjusting the straps of his backpack. Alex looked into the darkness. The rocks were still far away, as if they weren't getting any closer at all. It's a 2-hour journey, if you don't slow down. Max nodded, but his strength was running out. Hunger, fatigue, thirst, everything came in waves, forcing his body to fight with itself. And suddenly, the wind picked up sharply. At first it was just an impulse, then another one. The sand swirled in the air, and in a matter of seconds, a wall of sandstorm grew in front of my eyes. Damn it! We need shelter. Alex shouted, but his voice was immediately drowned out by the roaring wind. The sand hit my face, got into my eyes, nose, and mouth. The air became heavy, as if they were underwater. Visibility was gone. Max no longer saw Alex. Alex? Stop it, he shouted, but only the howling of the wind answered. Separation in the storm. Max looked around frantically, but all he saw was a swirl of sand. Where is he? Where to go? Alex! Stop it, he called again, covering his face with his hand. Suddenly, he slipped, the sand caved in under his feet, and he flew down. The blow was brutal. He rolled down the slope of a small dune, sand got stuffed down his neck, into his shoes, into his ears. When he finally stopped, the storm continued to roar around him. He had lost Alex. Max squeezed his eyes shut, trying not to panic. Where's up, where's down? Everything is mixed up. He couldn't breathe, every breath brought only sand to his lungs. He wrapped his face in his sweatshirt, covered his mouth and nose, trying to breathe through the fabric. I'm not going to die here. He muttered through clenched teeth. Surviving alone. The storm continued for several more hours. Max dug into the sand to get some cover, clutching a bottle of water in his hands as his last hope. When the wind finally died down, he cautiously got out of his hiding place. There was a new desert in front of him. The storm had erased all traces, leaving a smooth, lifeless surface. Alex. He looked around again, but there was no sign of his friend anywhere. Max was left alone. Alex, is he alive? Somewhere in the distance, a silhouette was struggling through the sands. Max didn't know how much time had passed since the storm had subsided. His fingers were swollen from exertion, and his eyes hurt from fatigue and sand. He sat with his back pressed against the stone, trying to comprehend what had happened. At first, it seemed to him that he and Alex had only been unable to find each other for a few minutes. But now that the dust has settled, he realized that the situation is much worse than he thought. Alex, where are you? What is it? He whispered, peering out into the desert. But the only answer was the silent horizon that stretched to the very edge of the earth. Max got to his feet, rubbing his stiff neck, and surveyed the area. He knew that his only hope was to move forward. He couldn't afford to give up, couldn't leave his friend in the desert. Search and fear. He chose a direction at random, towards what appeared to be a distant mountain range that was barely visible in the dim light. But the desert was cruel, and every step seemed like an eternity to him. Every minute, he wondered if he was making a mistake, if this would get him into even more trouble. After a while, his strength began to run out. His body ached, his lips were chapped, and his eyes couldn't focus, everything was blurry. Everything seemed dead, not alive. "Don't stop, don't give up," he repeated to himself. The footsteps became heavier and heavier, and soon he noticed how his fingers sank into the sand. He collapsed to his knees, desperately trying to breathe in some of the oxygen that was still in the air. Every cell in his body protested, but he stood up again. He couldn't stop. He had to find Alex, or at least something that would help them get out of here. An unexpected discovery. As Max continued on his way, something strange caught his eye. He couldn't immediately figure out what it was. A shadow? He squinted his eyes and tried to focus. It was a gap in the rock. He couldn't believe his eyes. He headed there, instinctively quickening his steps, and almost immediately saw that a small oasis was hiding in this gap. Water. And the shadow of a big stone. Max ran up and saw a small stream flowing from under the rock, creating a puddle. He grabbed the bottle and drank greedily. The water was cold and fresh, like a gift from the world itself. He took a deep breath, feeling his strength returning. But before he could look around, something else in the shadows caught his attention. "Alex?" It sounded more like a whisper than a real word, but it was important. He immediately went in that direction, trying not to take a single unnecessary step. At first it seemed to him that it was just a stone, but after looking closer, he noticed a body lying on the ground. He rushed to him. It was Alex. His face was pale and his body seemed dehydrated, but he was alive. He lay in the shadows, clearly struggling to survive, but not losing hope. Reunion and rescue. "Alex." Max bent down and shook his friend. "You're alive. Can you hear me?" Alex barely opened his eyes. His eyes were clouded, but he recognized Max. "Max?" His voice was hoarse. You came. I couldn't leave you. We'll both get out of here. Are you okay?" Alex barely nodded, but Max noticed how hot sweat was streaming down his face, as if he had just experienced a difficult moment. "You fainted. We'll find shelter, you won't survive here. You have to stand up, you have to hold on." Max spoke quickly, trying not to show how his heart was trembling with fear. But Alex, despite his weakness, took his hand. "Got it. But just you hold on too." Max helped his friend up. They started moving towards the oasis, hoping that this water source would give them a chance. But there was hope in their hearts. They were not alone in the desert. "We'll get out of here, I promise you." "I believe it." Max smiled, feeling the firmness in his voice return. They needed to move on, but now at least one friend was there.
When the first rays of dawnlight began to touch the horizon, Max and Alex were still moving towards the oasis. Despite the constant feeling of fatigue and tired legs, they did not give up. The water they found gave them strength, but Max still had one question in his head. How much longer could they hold out? "We're almost there, Max." Alex, still barely moving, but with a twinkle in his eyes, spoke with some optimism. His condition was improving, although every step was difficult. "Yes, we're not that far away. I know." But the desert was relentless. Even if they had water and food, they realized that their chances of surviving unaided were extremely slim. The sand in their faces, the stretching horizon, the scorching sun, all this continued to test their strength. As they approached a large rocky cliff, where there might have been a sheltered oasis, Max suddenly heard a sound. He stopped, listening. It was hard to spot among all the desert sounds, but the sound was familiar. "Do you hear that?" "What is it?" he asked, turning to Alex. "What?" Alex looked at him in disbelief. Max stood up again and listened, and then he heard it again. It was an explosive noise. "What is it?" "Definitely not a storm, not a sandy one. It's a car. It's someone coming." They both froze in place. The sounds grew louder and closer. Max's heart began to beat faster. Hope, as at the beginning of their journey, came alive again. It wasn't just a fantasy, they seemed to have broken the deadlock. It's them! We are saved! Max screamed, almost unable to believe what was happening. A few minutes later, Max could see a moving car on the horizon. It was a rescue jeep, red and bright against the background of the sands. He quickened his pace despite his fatigue. Alex followed him, desperately trying to walk, but his strength was at its limit. The driver of the rescue car noticed them and immediately stopped. He was an experienced and professional lifeguard, as it turned out later. He immediately approached them, noticing their exhausted faces and weak movements. "Are you okay?" His voice was stern, but with a hint of anxiety. "Thank God, yes. We thought we wouldn't survive." Max barely uttered the words. His words were weak and barely audible, but he and Alexei were alive. Rescuers helped them get into the car and offered them drinking water. For both of them, it was like coming back to life, to reality. "Have you been here long?" one of the rescuers asked. "How many days?" "We can't say for sure." Alex said it, not even believing that he could finally speak. "We'll get you out of here. Just hold on, everything will be fine." When the jeep set off towards the rescue, Max and Alex were lying in the back seat, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The desert was behind them, and now, after all the trials, they could breathe a sigh of relief. With every kilometer they traveled, their bodies and minds were freed from the frightening memories. But the desert had left its mark, and they knew they had a long road to recovery ahead of them. Coming back to life, rescuers brought them to the nearest town, where they have already received medical treatment. Doctors provided them with the necessary care, moistened their bodies, and checked their condition. Max and Alex survived the scariest part of the journey, but it was not so easy to return to a normal life. They didn't talk much about what happened. The desert remained in their memory, like a dark veil hiding difficulties and trials. But now, they knew one thing. No problem could be stronger than a man who decided to fight. And although they were safe, they both understood that the desert, its heat and dangers would always haunt them. She will remain in their thoughts and in their nightmares, but they survived. And that was all they needed to know. "We did it. We're through," Max said, and there was more power in his voice than he could ever have expected. They both survived, no matter what. It was their greatest victory,